Now, can I call on Deputy Nasser Hurricane to announce the order of business for the week, please? Deputy.
The business today shall be set out in the second revised report of the Business Committee 6th of May 2020. In relation to Wednesday's business, it is proposed that, notwithstanding anything in standing orders, the only business to be taken shall be the business as set out in the second revised report of the Business Committee dated 6th of May 2020, with no questions on promised legislation. Between each set of statements and questions and answers, the House shall suspend for a period not exceeding 20 minutes. Item 4. Statements following video conference of members of the European Council shall conclude within 2 hours unless previously concluded. The statements of a Minister or Minister of State and the main spokespersons for parties and groups or a member nominated in their stead shall not exceed 10 minutes each. A Minister or Minister for State shall take questions for a period not exceeding 20 minutes. And item 3A, motion re-establishment of Special Committee on COVID-19 response shall be taken without debate and any division demanded shall be taken immediately. Item 5, statement and questions and answers on tourism, and item 6, statements and questions and answers on childcare shall each conclude within 2 hours, if not previously concluded. Each shall consist of an opening statement by a Minister or Minister of State of 10 minutes, followed by questions and answers not exceeding 110 minutes. Questions and answers by Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin shall not exceed 15 minutes each, with all other parties and groups having 10 minutes each. In relation to Thursday's business, it is proposed that, notwithstanding anything in standing orders, the Dáil shall sit at 12 noon on Thursday and shall sit later than 8:03 p.m. The Dáil shall adjourn on the conclusion of the statement by the Minister for Housing, Planning and... Sorry, I just cut out. Excuse me, Karen Corlett. Housing, Planning and Local Government and questions and answers on COVID-19. Item 7, statements and questions and answers to the Taoiseach shall not exceed 100 minutes, with each party or group having 10 minutes. Item 3B, motion rearrangements for reinstatement of written parliamentary questions shall be taken without debate and any division demanded shall be taken immediately. Item 8, statements on Brexit, followed by questions and answers to the Taoiseach, shall conclude within 2 hours unless previously concluded. An opening statement by the Taoiseach of 15 minutes shall be followed by statements by the main spokespersons for parties and groups or a member nominated in their stead of 5 minutes each. Following the statements, questions and answers for parties and groups shall not exceed 6 minutes each, followed by a 5-minute response by the Taoiseach. Item 9, statements by the Minister for Health and questions and answers on COVID-19, and item 10, statements by the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government and questions and answers on COVID-19 shall each conclude within 2 hours, if not previously concluded. Each shall consist of an opening statement by a Minister or Minister of State of 10 minutes, followed by questions and answers not exceeding 110 minutes. Questions and answers by Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin shall not exceed 15 minutes each, with all other parties and groups having 10 minutes each. And the Dáil shall adjourn on the conclusion of statements by the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government and questions and answers on COVID-19 until 12 noon on Wednesday the 12th of May 2020. Thank you, Cairn
Deputy, there are 2 proposals arising from that to put to the House today. Firstly, is the proposal for dealing with today's business agreed to? Agreed. Yes.
In relation to the new committee that's proposed, I saw on television we're having a new committee to discuss COVID-19. And I wonder, is it possible for members to be given the terms of reference of that committee? I noticed that its membership...
You're on the order paper, Deputy.
I note that it seems to be done on something of the Hunt system, in that the larger parties have 4 and proportionately less than for the smaller groupings. So can I ask, with what frequency is it going to meet? And would it be with the same frequency as the Dáil Reform Committee that was constituted here 6 or 7 weeks ago? Because I think it would be superficial for us to set up a committee again that doesn't meet. And secondly, can I ask that you, as Ceann Comhairle, an ex officio chair of the Business Committee, might propose the reconfiguration of the Business Committee in the same way proportionately as the new COVID-19 committee is constituted, which would obviously be entirely more proportionately representative of the Dáil than it currently is constituted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Is the proposal for dealing with today's business agreed to? Agreed. And secondly, is the proposal for dealing with Thursday's business agreed to? Agreed. Thank you very much. We move then to the first item on the agenda, which are statements following video conference of members of the European Council. And I call on the Taoiseach, Deputy Leo Varadkar, to make his opening statement under Standing Order 55. Taoiseach, you have 10 minutes.
On Thursday, the 23rd of April, I joined other members of the European Council by video conference to discuss the coronavirus emergency and to chart a path towards economic and social recovery. This was the fourth such meeting, with previous meetings having taken place on the 10th, 17th and 26th of March. I welcome the opportunity to provide an account of these meetings to the Dáil and to exchange views and ideas with members. Sadly, when this emergency started, the level of coordination across the European Union was poor. Member States did their own thing, very often because they were responding to a pandemic that was happening at a different pace in different countries. And of course, as we all know, public health is a national, not a European competence. At its best, the European Union stands for freedom, peace and solidarity, and a belief that we can achieve something greater by acting together as a continent. Europe showed what these values meant recently during the first phase of the Brexit negotiations, and now must do so again during this pandemic. We must have a coordinated response based on solidarity and demonstrate that the European ideal shines brightest when things are at their darkest. In our meetings, the European Council has focused on 5 strategic areas of work where we believe cooperation is essential. First, limiting the spread of the virus. Second, ensuring the supply of medicines, equipment and goods. Third, supporting research. Fourth, alleviating the socio-economic consequences for our people. And fifth, cooperating to bring citizens home from other countries. At our meeting on the 23rd of April, we welcomed in particular the joint European roadmap towards the lifting of COVID-19 containment measures. This was published by the Commission on the 15th of April. It sets out a principles-based and science-led approach to reopening our societies and economies. This was widely welcomed and aligns with the approach that we've taken as a government to date. Across Europe, our first responsibility and our highest responsibility has been to protect the lives and health of our citizens. We see this in the Commission's work on a shared procurement framework for PPE and other medical supplies, EU research funding for the development of effective diagnostics and therapeutics, as well as a coordinated approach to working towards an effective vaccine for SARS-CoV-2. I welcome that the European Commission is building a strategic stockpile of medical equipment from which Member States will be able to draw in future and indeed in the near present. In fact, batches of FFP2 protective masks were distributed from this stock in recent days to Spain, Italy and Croatia. There is more to do, and we need to consider how to make the European Union more resilient and more responsive as we chart our way through and beyond this crisis. At our first meeting, we agreed to coordinate the repatriation of our citizens stranded across the globe as a result of the pandemic. To date, repatriation efforts have brought over 500,000 EU citizens back to their home countries. These include people repatriated to Ireland on special flights we chartered from Peru and India, which citizens of 17 other countries also travelled on, and indeed we've availed of the reverse from other countries. We agreed on the 17th of March that we'd do whatever it takes to meet the current challenges, to restore confidence and to support a rapid recovery. So we invited the Eurogroup of EU finance ministers to scrutinise economic and financial developments and adopt a coordinated policy approach. The President of the European Central Bank, Madame Christine Lagarde, has participated in each of these meetings, and she strongly supported our position that we need to provide monetary flexibilities to protect the European economy, at least in the initial stages of this economic crisis. The crisis has had deep and sharp economic and social impacts, which everyone in the House will be well aware of. We've already seen the stresses and strains across all countries of the European Union, and some more so than others have been particularly affected. At our meeting on the 26th of March, we discussed how we can best respond to this crisis collectively. Together, we must deal with the immediate issues arising and drive our recovery into the medium and longer term and ensure that it is sustainable. Before that meeting, I joined 8 of my colleagues in advancing an approach that would have led to the mutualisation of debt known in shorthand as Corona bonds. The idea was to take a shared approach to managing debt arising solely from this crisis. This could be spending directed towards our health services, or wider spending that governments have to undertake in order to protect their welfare states and refloat their economies. Such an approach would have required a legal underpinning not currently provided for in the European treaties, and I accept that it would have taken a long time to agree this, even more if it had to be approved in all member states, and even more if some, including ours, required a referendum. But it was still worth exploring. In the absence of unanimous support for that approach, we agreed that alternative solutions for a recovery fund should be developed. And I have to say I'm supportive of the broad suite of measures taken at EU level. These include a temporary relaxation of state aid rules, under which Ireland has 2 aid packages totalling €400 million approved by the Commission to assist our most affected companies. However, we need to ensure that Member States don't use state aid to give an unfair advantage to companies in other Member States that they compete with. And this is something we're going to watch very closely. We've also invoked the escape clause in the Stability and Growth Pact to give Member States additional flexibility to spend and borrow more in response to this crisis. We all appreciate this cannot go on forever, but it is appropriate that we do so at this particular point in the cycle. The European Central Bank has also played an important role in ensuring stability in the middle of this extraordinary crisis, including through its €750 billion pandemic emergency purchase programme. Capital rules for banks have also been eased to ensure that they can lend into the real economy, providing liquidity to businesses under pressure. At our meeting on the 23rd of April, we endorsed an economic package agreed by the Eurogroup, worth up to €500 billion, and we asked that it be operational in the first week in June. The package contains 3 elements. First, a €100 billion EU SURE instrument, which will provide financial assistance in the form of loans granted on favourable terms to cover initiatives such as short-term work schemes and similar measures for the self-employed. This would include, for example, our temporary wage subsidy scheme. A €200 billion EIB COVID-19 guarantee fund for crisis lending to SMEs, mid-caps and corporates, underpinned by €25 billion in member states. And a €240 billion ESM-operated pandemic crisis support instrument to provide a backstop for member states to make available sovereign funding of up to 2% of GDP for direct and indirect healthcare expenditures. It should be noted that these are all loans and guarantees and are not grants, and borrowed money must be repaid. Taken together, these 3 measures represent an EU fiscal response of over €500 billion, I mentioned earlier, an historic level deployment of resources to respond to an emergency of unprecedented levels, and a much greater and more appropriate response from the European Union than we saw during the financial crisis 10 or 12 years ago, when the European Union acted in a way that was too little and too late. Looking beyond the immediate crisis, we agreed the need to put in place a recovery fund to rebuild our economies, reopen our businesses, and get our citizens back to work. We also welcome the joint roadmap for recovery and asked the Presidents of the European Commission and Council to bring it forward. It also sets out a framework for collective action towards recovery, including a fully functioning single market, an unparalleled investment effort, and a commitment to the European Union playing its part in driving a global recovery. As a necessary next step to this work, we welcome the European Commission's proposal that it undertake a sector-by-sector analysis of the economic impact of the crisis and to identify and target supports necessary for recovery for those particular sectors. We also agreed that climate action and the digital economy should be critical components of this recovery plan. This crisis has dealt a terrible shock to our economies, but also creates an opportunity to make sure that the recovery European-wide is climate-proofed and technology-driven. I believe that the EU budget, the MFF, is the most obvious vehicle for doing this. So I've asked the Commission to look again at the MFF proposal and to consider how it and the Recovery Fund should be linked. As is well known, there were strongly strongly held different views around the table on how this should be financed. Some believe there should be transfers from other countries to those countries most affected in the form of grants. Generally speaking, a transfer from north to south. Others expressed the view that loans were the only acceptable option to their citizens and also the legal order of their nations and their constitution. I articulated the view that both could play a part and that the right balance between loans and grants is what we should aim for. I also argued that I couldn't accept any approach that deployed the MFF to the detriment of proper funding of the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Farming and agribusiness in the food sector was already facing great challenges and has been deeply affected by this crisis. Successful and well-functioning programmes such as CAP, Cohesion and Horizon will help drive our recovery and therefore should be funded properly for the next 7 years. At this time of crisis, we see the strategic importance of a strong agri-food sector, providing European citizens with food security and affordable food. CAP is needed now more than ever, perhaps as much as it was needed when it was first invented. During this emergency, we've seen huge stresses on the single market, as some internal borders closed to people, goods and services, albeit temporarily. As was predictable, countries that closed their borders and introduced export bans had to reverse them within weeks, when they learned very quickly that the benefits were less than the costs. I believe a fully functioning single market and free trade beyond our borders will be necessary as we recover from the recession induced by COVID-19. In her wrap-up statement, Minister McEntee will discuss the package of measures being taken at EU level to support partner countries globally. As part of the European Union's global effort, over 3.3 billion of EU financial support has been mobilised for the Western Balkans for COVID-19 and the post-pandemic recovery. This is our neighbourhood, and it's the right thing that we should help them. Later this afternoon, I'll participate in a Western Balkans summit with EU leaders and heads of government from the Western Balkan states. This will also be done by video conference, so I apologise that I have to leave this session early in order to take part in that. Finally, Ceann Comhairle, on Saturday we mark Europe Day, and I believe this date should serve as a reminder of what we've achieved together. The European Union is held together by its values: respect for democracy, the rule of law, individual freedom, equality before the law, our unique model, which is the social market economy, and the 4 freedoms. It should also remind us that so many of the problems and challenges that we face don't recognise borders drawn by mankind, whether it's health emergencies like pandemics, environmental emergencies like climate change, security threats like international terrorism, or global economic movements. The pooling of resources and the creation of safety nets and the adoption of collective measures are necessary to drive our recovery. This is particularly important for small countries like Ireland, with a population of only 5 million. Our best hope for the future lies in working together, being at that top table in the European Union, and making sure that we're at the heart of the common European home that we help to build. I welcome the views and thoughts of members today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Micheál Martin, please.
Ní neart go cur le chéile an seanachil agus is tócha agus an bhrí sin atá gríleár an Aontas Eorpach. Tá géir rá có-ibrú den sco idir buail an Aontais eiscint chun Dáil leis an víras córáineach agus an géarchéim Gallagher a bhaineann leis. Is léir go bhfuil míad a bhfad níos láidre ag obair le chéile. Ach is léir go bhfuil a bhfad níos mó le déanamh ag an Aontas Eorpach go háirithe maidir leis an dúchláin olmhór atá amachróin I dtaobh cuasaíocht amíochta. Maidir leis an víras córáineach measam go raibh an Comisiún Maol I d'Sach ach díag ar níag tá feabhas tagatha ar an scéal. The events of the past 2.5 months have once again highlighted the great strengths and serious weaknesses of the European Union as currently constructed. The failure of leaders participating in the European Council summits to agree a radical response to a unique emergency should be of grave concern to everyone. Measures which have been announced are welcome, and they will help, but they go nowhere near providing the scale and range of action which Europe needs if it's to recover quickly. For a few years, Fianna Fáil have been pushing for Ireland to take a more active role in not just defending Europe, but in helping to develop Europe. We have called for this country and its partners to break free of the defensive posture which has been adopted in response to the anti-European Union rhetoric of the right and of the left. A debate which looks at every issue as a zero-sum game defined by who gets our money has been highly destructive in the past, and it will continue to be so. Collectively, we have asked the European Union to take a lead in promoting innovation, guaranteeing food security, promoting regional development, securing our energy supplies, tackling long-term unemployment, ensuring we address the climate emergency, stabilising and reforming the financial system, and many other tasks. And now we look to it to limit the financial damage of a severe pandemic and help countries to recover from a profound economic shock. But the simple fact is that the European Union has been denied the resources and powers it needs to deliver the agenda we have set for it. A budget limited to a combined national income of 1%, a range of measures designed to limit fiscal transfers, a ban on raising collectively assured debt, a requirement that all emergency funding be taken from existing programmes. And on top of this, the European Central Bank, the one institution which is willing to act with true urgency and ambition, is under assault as a result of a remarkable judgment from the German Constitutional Court. It should be of grave concern that the Court believes that the European Central Bank's measures are, quote, disproportionate to the economic and fiscal policy effects, unquote. It is hard to conceive of any circumstance more serious than the one we face today, and the idea that the European Central Bank's response could be considered to be disproportionate is almost bizarre. While this is not something which is receiving a lot of attention today, this is just as serious as when there was an attempt to block the ECB action which saved the euro from disintegration during the financial crisis. So while we welcome the measures agreed at the summit and Ireland's late conversion to supporting collective borrowing, we reject the idea that anywhere near enough has been agreed or that what has been agreed has been delivered. Other than the outbreak of a war, there has never before been such a dramatic and rapid public health and economic shock. Just like every other country in Europe, Ireland does not yet really know the scale of the recovery challenge we face. If the Member States of the Union continue to block measures to develop new direct funding mechanisms, then the Union's contribution will continue to be economically marginal. If ever there was a time to reflect on the importance of cooperation between states and strong shared institutions, this is it. Without the international public organisations, the world would be in a much, much worse position today. While there should be a comprehensive and independent inquiry into the early stages of the pandemic, an inquiry focused on what can be done better next time, the World Health Organization has proven its value, and we strongly support the efforts to secure its funding. We also believe we should acknowledge the work of the European Centre for Disease Control. It is not a high-profile European Union body, but it does essential work in sharing information and coordinating responses among European Union members. It is also important to acknowledge the work of scientists working in our universities and institutes. On top of being central to much of the response here, many teams are working on different parts of the challenges of developing both treatments and vaccines. It is a reminder to us all of the importance of having a wide research base, and that not all of this can or should be linked to commercial objectives. The societal and public health benefits which come from having a broad range of scientific expertise here are simply undeniable. A development of deep concern in the past 2 months has been the way in which some governments appear to see the pandemic as an opportunity to entrench themselves. The effective suspension of Parliament in Hungary is clearly a major breach of the core democratic principles which Hungary signed up to when seeking membership of the European Union. Every country has had to implement emergency measures to respond to the pandemic, but the powers grabbed by the Orban government go well beyond anything seen elsewhere. In many countries, there have been questions about whether the media has been challenging enough concerning government action, but only in Hungary has the government taken major new censorship powers to itself. One decree in recent weeks has given the government the power in Hungary to effectively confiscate money from local authorities without appeal. So far, this power has only been used to take money from districts controlled by the opposition, and the combination of suspending parliamentary oversight and controlling the media means that there has been no means of challenging this. In this context, the sense that Viktor Orban can act with impunity and the European Union Council will do nothing is deeply corrosive of the foundations of the Union. One of the highest net recipients of European Union support, whose economy is profoundly based on free access to the single market, is challenging the basic idea that you must be a free democracy with genuine checks on power if you are to be a member of the Union. To simply ignore this and hope it will sort itself out isn't good enough. Last week, the European Parliament raised its concerns about the possible watering down of a Commission report on the spreading of pandemic disinformation. It is not yet clear what happened, but there should be no doubt about core principles. The spreading of disinformation by states outside of the European Union has reached dramatic proportions in the last decade. The efforts to support the far left and far right has been a core part of a strategy to undermine democracy and the Union itself. In recent months, there has been widespread evidence of conspiracy theories and false claims being created and spread relating to the origins and impact of the virus. Member States rely on the institutions of the Union to monitor and report honestly about this issue. Under no circumstances should the honest assessment of relevant experts be watered down or censored. At a minimum, there should be a comprehensive explanation of what happened in this circumstance, and any removed material should be published. In terms of specific measures taken during the summer, what we need is to move as quickly as possible to implementation. The delay which has characterised funding initiatives in recent years can't continue. Equally, we support the call of President Macron and the French Minister for Finance to return to discussing more ambitious actions. Obviously, Brexit hasn't gone away, and it appears likely that there will be major decisions to be taken in the coming weeks and months. This will be discussed at length tomorrow, so I will leave most of Fianna Fáil's comments to that session. However, it is important to state today that the threat of a chaotic Brexit remains, and the need for us to prepare for all eventualities is more significant than ever. The extraordinary position of London that no European Union office will be agreed for Belfast appears like a demonstration of bad faith concerning the operationalising of what has been agreed relating to Northern Ireland. It may be some form of negotiating tactic, the logic of which remains hidden. However, there is nothing positive about London citing a concern with community divisions in Northern Ireland which had not existed before. No one in Northern Ireland appears to object to the idea that there be any European Union office in Belfast. So the London government's position is both of concern and, in my view, potentially highly divisive.
Thank you, Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, please.
Deputy Conway Walsh.
Fine.
Thank you, the COVID-19 emergency has no doubt presented the people of Europe with an unprecedented crisis and challenge. The virus has attacked our societies, ravaged our economies, and tested our communities in previously unimaginable ways. And despite the painful and cruel nature of this pandemic, the people of Europe have rallied. They've rallied and they have demonstrated, as you put it, Taoiseach, Europe as at its best. Solidarity, compassion, social justice. We have endured and we will endure, not because of the worst of Europe, the worst being corporate greed, an aggressive doctrinaire neoliberal approach, vested interest, privatisation, the running down of social protections and workers' rights. No, Europe's people will thrive despite all of that. And it's incredible that a huge economic system and political systems globally brought to their knees by this deadly virus, and yet the people prevail. And it is they who most effectively articulate what Europe is and what the European Union should be. You see Germans singing Bella Ciao, that great anthem of the Italian resistance, in solidarity with their beleaguered Italian friends. You see Spaniards clapping their health workers on their way into work every night, and in households here, you see people placing candles in the window to honour all who have tragically lost their loved ones. That is the real measure and value of what should be the European project. Workers and families of the European Union share a common hope also for the future, that the recovery, which will surely follow, must be fair, and that progress is built as we emerge from this crisis with people, citizens and solidarity front and centre. You see, in the aftermath of this pandemic, we cannot perpetuate an economic system of winners and losers. We can't have a scenario where some profit from the pandemic while others are saddled with crushing debts, from mortgages to rents and to utility bills. Ordinary people have to come first in this recovery. And this means also giving back to low-paid and frontline workers who managed to carry us all through this emergency. Caithfí gná daoine a bheith chun tosaí san am seo. Ní féidir leis na hibrithe riachtanach aniu bheith na hibrithe darmata amórach. The essential workers of today cannot become the forgotten workers of tomorrow. And to that end, a lot has been said about those who work in retail. Debenham workers are outside the gate today. Workers whose employer availed of this public health emergency to cast them aside, to dispense with their services. And the truth is that the government here did little or nothing to secure those jobs. It's astonishing. The Bank of Ireland is a minority shareholder in Debenhams, and yet the government has sat on its hands, and it looks like Debenhams will get away scot-free and the workers are left high and dry. So perhaps we should start there with that set of workers to demonstrate what the new recovery and the new economic and social order might be. 10 years ago, the European Union was faced with a different crisis, a seismic economic recession as a result of the banking collapse. And at that time, it was faced with a real choice: the imposition of austerity that would punish workers, families and communities for the reckless gambling of bankers and financial speculators, or the choice of building a recovery through investment and stimulus that would protect ordinary people and really kickstart economies. The European Union at that time chose austerity, which Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in government implemented with great relish. And the people of this state paid a very heavy price in the form of devastating cuts to services, soaring unemployment and staggering levels of emigration. The consequences of this austerity was severe hardship, particularly for low and middle income workers, whilst those at the top were insulated. Indeed, let it be said, many of them thrived in this savage environment, and that cannot happen again, Taoiseach. There can be no return to austerity in the wake of this emergency. And to that end, you noted that the fiscal rules within the European Union are currently suspended, but you also know, as outlined in black and white in the Stability Programme update, the spring update, this is only a temporary state of affairs, and the excessive deficit rules will apply again in the future. And the Irish people, as I've said, are all too well aware what austerity looks like and how it feels from the time of the last crisis. The European Commission at that time and the European system was no great friend to Ireland or our people. And there are huge concerns now amongst workers and families that we are looking at a déjà vu, a rerun of that scenario. And I listened to the Minister for Finance this morning, and I am very concerned. He suggested that financial supports for hundreds of thousands of workers will come to an end in June. That is an intolerable proposition. That's not acceptable, and I hope that you will confirm for the Dáil Taoiseach that that will not happen. The better way to manage this crisis is to take those decisions that serve the interests of workers and families, and this isn't pie in the sky before anyone dismisses it. This is actually about having the courage, the ambition, the political imagination to make better choices. It's also about doing the right thing. And no longer can our society be held back by the naysayers who say that a fair recovery and a more equal society isn't possible. Indeed, many of the things that you in Fine Gael and you in Fianna Fáil told us were impossible in the course of the recent election have been done in a few short weeks. Voila! All could be done, including a rent freeze, the thing that you railed against. The people of Ireland don't want a repeat of the lost decade. I would say to you they will not tolerate it. We now need a new vision for our society and our economy as we keep our place as proud Europeans, as proud global citizens, as people who care for ourselves, our families and for each other.
Deputy Conway Walsh.
As we work our way out of the turmoil of this pandemic, the entire EU project faces an extraordinary test. But there are opportunities not only to address the democratic deficit that contributed to Brexit, but to reshape many aspects of our society and indeed of the whole of our island. The EU has a major and crucial role to play in this transition, and the EU financial support package, the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact, the temporary relaxing of state aid rules, the CAP transition regulation, and of course the next CAP programmes have to be used to invigorate the regions. Now is the time to firmly place balanced regional development and rural Ireland front and centre of EU and government policy by identifying and implementing rural solutions to national problems. All too often we in rural Ireland hear about the millions and billions that are made available, but it's always out of our reach. Too much bureaucracy and too many unidentified beneficiaries. And to that end, I have great concerns about the high interest rates being charged by banks at the moment when we see globally interest rates being so low. It would be unthinkable that the banks were to again capitalise on the backs of ordinary people. But during this pandemic, focus has been put on the fact that 40% of the population live in the Dublin area and 44% of people work here. Now, only a fool would consider this imbalance to be sustainable or even safe. Investment policies driven by population numbers simply do not work. We can no longer miss out on the opportunities to deepen and widen the links between education and industry, or to forgo opportunities of remote working and learning because we don't have equal access to broadband and telecommunications. We are losing out so much on human capital, denying children and adults of children with autism and those living with disabilities the opportunities to develop and use their abilities and talents to their full potential. The economic recovery must include fast-tracking of critical and physical telecommunications, infrastructure, as well as introducing fairness into our fishing and agricultural industries. We must ensure that we proactively pursue all monetary opportunities, as well as using the fiscal instruments available to direct industry and job creation. The long-promised strategic development zone at Knock Airport must be advanced as a matter of urgency, and the airport itself must be enabled to reach its full potential as a catalyst for growth in the West. The EU Commission proposal to make 2021 the EU Year of Rail presents us with opportunities to bring the Western Rail Corridor to fruition and to upgrade existing rail lines. We now have an opportunity to reconfigure our health services to provide equality of access to all of our citizens, no matter where we live. So to squander this crisis would be a travesty. The crisis itself brings about change, but it is inevitable, but the progress is optional. As this is my maiden speech, Cancórla, I want to sincerely thank the people of Mayo for placing their trust in me and in Sinn Féin, and assure them that this seat belongs to them, and I will certainly use it wisely. Gormagat.
Congratulations, Deputy. Deputy Roderick O'Gorman, please.
Thank you, Count Corla. I'd like to thank the Taoiseach for outlining the key conclusions from April's European Council meeting. And I welcome the Council's discussion of the joint European roadmap towards lifting of COVID-19 containment measures. I also welcome the endorsement by the European Council of the Eurogroup's agreement on safety nets for workers, businesses and sovereigns. The maintenance of workers' incomes, either through wage subsidy schemes to keep jobs or direct financial assistance like the pandemic payment here in Ireland, is a key responsibility of all governments. It's also important to note that the EU has recognised the scale of the crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic poses across the Union by recognising that the conditions for the use of the General Escape Clause of the EU's fiscal framework, where there's a severe economic downturn in the Eurozone or across the Union as a whole, has been met. That step, combined with the novel use of the EU budget via the Coronavirus Response and Investment Initiative and the actions of the European Central Bank to support liquidity and financing conditions, demonstrate the ability of the EU to react jointly and with a sense of solidarity. However, we regret that we did not see that same sense of solidarity expressed from some member states, particularly with respect to novel ways in which the EU could support member states' borrowing as they emerge from the crisis. I'd like to reference in particular the joint roadmap for recovery that was presented at the European Council meeting. This is described as a comprehensive recovery plan and unprecedented investment that will help the EU relaunch and transform its economies. Central to this joint roadmap for recovery is the European Green Deal. In Ireland over the last 2 weeks, there's been extensive discussion of how we can meet the target of cutting carbon emissions by at least an average annual of 7% between now and 2030. A lot of the coverage is focused on the financial costs of the policies needed to achieve this. Taoiseach, I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss how at EU level the recovery from the economic shock created by the coronavirus is linked to the Green European Deal, how the policy changes we are implementing will be supported by EU-wide policy approaches, and in particular, how major funding is being provided at EU level to finance these policies. Currently, under EU law, the Union is committed to a 40% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. However, as part of the EU's move to achieve the target set out in the Paris Agreement, it plans to increase its 2030 commitments to a cut of between 50 and 55%. This change is being brought forward as part of a new EU climate law, which the Commission has recently proposed. Once this law is passed, it will be binding on all EU member states, including Ireland. A reduction of at least 7% average per annum in Ireland will enable us to meet this target. It is important to remember that this target is not Ireland going alone. It is part of a collective EU response to the decision by all 27 member states, including Ireland, to sign up to the Paris Agreement, and it will be legally binding on Ireland and all the other member states within the year. Obviously, setting a target of at least 7% average annual emission reductions is not enough on its own. Success will only be achieved through a range of policy measures that will deliver reductions in each part of the economy. As part of the European Green Deal, the EU will bring forward specific policies in 2020 and 2021 supporting the achievement of its new emission reduction targets. New CO2 emission standards for vehicles, including vans and trucks, are currently being set. Later this year, there will be a funding call to support the development of public recharging and refuelling points as part of alternative fuel infrastructure. There will be a new strategy on offshore wind, something that will help support Ireland as we seek to develop this hugely underused resource, which could deliver us 5 gigawatts per year of clean and cheap energy by 2025. And a new circular economy action plan will be developed. This will include a sustainable products initiative and a particular focus on resource-intensive sectors such as textiles, construction, electronics and plastics. Ireland, the EU, we can be at the forefront of designing products where waste is minimised. But changes of this scale have a cost, but the EU is providing a huge body of funding to enable these changes to be financed. Central to the European Green Deal is the European Green Deal Investment Plan, which proposes to mobilise at least €1 trillion in sustainable investment over the next decade. €500 billion is to be provided by the EU budget for climate and environmental spending between 2021 and 2030. This will trigger additional national co-financing of €114 billion over this time frame, again on climate and environmental projects. The Invest EU fund will leverage about €280 billion for climate and environmentally friendly related investments by providing an EU budget guarantee to reduce risk. And the innovation and modernisation funds, which are financed through the revenues from the auctioning of carbon allowances under the emissions trading scheme, will provide at least €25 billion for the EU transition towards climate neutrality. Beyond the EU budget itself, other EU funding bodies are changing their mandate to better reflect the need for climate action. The European Investment Bank has launched its new energy lending policy, which aims to end financing for fossil fuel energy projects by the end of 2021. Its investment priorities are now shifting to clean energy innovation, energy efficiency projects and renewables. One of the principles of the European Green Deal is that no person and no place is left behind. The Green Party has always advocated for the need for a just transition whereby the rights of workers and communities who are currently dependent on fossil fuel industries are provided for in the move to more sustainable energy production through investment, retraining and diversification of local economies. Across the EU, this is a huge issue as communities in parts of Poland, Germany and France are deeply dependent on coal mining. In Ireland, those regions associated with peat cutting, particularly in the Midlands, need to be protected. To facilitate this, a just transition mechanism is being put in place. The aim of this funding mechanism is to promote and develop new skills among workers and support the growth of businesses. It is expected that between the fund and Member States' own commitments, between 30 and 50 billion will be available. This fund will target fossil fuels, including peat and greenhouse gas intensive industries. The scale of the investment that I've set out here, €1 trillion over 10 years, will not only help create jobs in Ireland, but will also spur new industries. There's going to be a huge benefit for those countries in those regions that put in place the proposals that can seek EU funding, co-funding, or support from the European Investment Bank. A number of European governments, particularly in the East, have taken the direction of opposing climate action, of refusing to move their economies in a more sustainable direction. Those countries will lose out on the potential to get this massive investment. Ireland must not do this. Ireland must put in place the national policies that connect with these EU policies so we can benefit from this investment, so we can develop new industries around renewables, so we can create new jobs all over the country and particularly in those communities in transition. Ceann Comhairle, every action taken by any government across the planet for the foreseeable future will be coloured by the COVID-19 crisis. Earlier this week, a group of well-known economists, including Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern, published a paper in which they examined whether the recovery packages being prepared to follow the COVID-19 crisis will be beneficial to climate policies I've already spoken about or run contrary to them. Their research finds that recovery packages that seek synergies between climate and economic goals have better prospects for increasing national wealth and enhancing productive human, social, physical, intangible and natural capital. They also state that green fiscal recovery packages can act to decouple economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions and reduce existing welfare inequalities that will be exacerbated by the pandemic in the short term and by climate change in the long term. As we hopefully begin to emerge from the worst of the coronavirus crisis, we can choose what kind of recovery this can be. What I hope to see, and what we will work for as a party, is a recovery that works for all, rooted in European solidarity that confronts the challenges we face. We are in a climate emergency. The costs of failing to meet the 7% target are catastrophic. That is the scientific consensus, and so it's on that basis that we should plan. It's also the clear direction of the European Union. The European Council sees the European Green Deal as central to its joint roadmap for recovery. The policies I've outlined can help to create jobs and support a recovery from COVID-19, which is equitable and sustainable in every sense of the word. Thank you, Céarla.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now we go to Deputy Duncan Smith, please.
Thank you for the update. Once again, the EU is faced with a major crisis, and this crisis has the potential to make or break the Union. The test this time is whether the EU can demonstrate solidarity between its member states based on shared democratic values, or whether it wants to just be a marketplace. One of the reasons why the UK was never fully integrated into the EU was because they only really wanted a single market and not a political community. But Labour's view is that the EU can only be successful if it is built on solidarity and mutual assistance between its member states. We welcome the EU's decision to use €540 billion from the European Stability Mechanism to assist member states without many of the onerous rules that usually come with ESM loans. We also particularly welcome the recent action by the EU to host donations to developing countries to assist them in their response to the epidemic. The target of €7.5 billion set on the 4th of May was essentially reached within 24 hours, which is a testament to the surge of global solidarity brought about by the COVID-19 epidemic. But my main focus is on the idea of a European Recovery Fund. My colleagues from the Party of European Socialists proposed a €1.5 trillion recovery fund to help all our countries rebuild after this crisis. I'm glad that EU leaders recently agreed to create a new fund of at least €1 trillion, which is a great step forward. However, a lot hinges on the model of financing used to underpin this fund and decisions about how the fund will operate. In short, we need a fund that distributes grants as well as loans, which targets more assistance to the worst affected countries on the basis of solidarity, not their proportion of the EU's population. And we also need the fund to be financed at EU level, not by piling unsustainable debt onto member states' already overstretched national debts. The Recovery Fund proposal is important, so I'd like to speak about it in more detail. The first point is fairly self-evident. When countries and major employers are already overstretched, they cannot afford to take on too much additional debt. There are going to be many viable enterprises across Europe that will be only viable if they are given grant aid and not loans. Likewise, there are countries that will have the capacity to quickly get their public finances in order, but only if they are given grants again and not loans. The choice is between being pragmatic about what will work versus being ideologically opposed to grants. Unfortunately, a number of governments across the EU are ideologically opposed to the idea of giving grants to other member states. The irony is that this ideological position will make the EU's recovery slower and more painful, just like after the 2008 banking crisis, when the same ideology dominated EU thinking. We cannot make the same mistake twice. Other parts of the world came out of the 2008 crash faster because they were not prisoners of this ideology. Across Europe, people cannot be asked to endure another set of austerity years. People will not tolerate more austerity, and we have already seen the rise of Eurosceptic and far-right politics in response to these ruinous policies. This time around, the EU has to give grants in addition to loans if economic recovery is to be faster and more sustainable. The second point is that the European Recovery Fund must be focused on the areas of greatest need, regardless of geography. In normal times, the EU carefully allocates funds based on member states' population size and contribution to the EU budget. But we are not living in normal times, and those rules cannot apply. A European Recovery Fund needs to allocate money to where it is most needed to boost recovery and to rescue as many viable jobs as possible in the aftermath of this crisis. It is also an opportunity to direct funds towards environmentally sustainable activity and to speed up the EU's transition to a low-carbon economy. Again, this is a choice between being pragmatic about what actions will help economic recovery versus being ideologically opposed to any kind of fiscal transfer. Unfortunately, a similar set of governments are blocking this idea because they fear a domestic political backlash if they are seen as using their own tax revenue to fund other countries' recovery. However, the Party of European Socialist model of a European recovery took this concern into account. There is no need for Member States to fund other Member States directly as long as the EU borrows money at EU level and repays that money from its own resources. As such, there should be no objection to channeling money to where it is most needed, as that will benefit the whole EU in the long term. We will all be worse off if regions of Europe are left behind in the recovery. Hence, the Recovery Fund must be targeted where it is most needed. The third point about the Recovery Fund is that it should be raised at EU level and paid for at EU level. In this context, I'm glad to see that our own government has backed the proposal for Eurobonds to fund this recovery. The logic of raising debt at EU level to create the Recovery Fund is fairly straightforward. Many EU Member States have relatively high public debts following the disaster of 2008. Some of us will find it difficult to borrow money to raise those debts further, even though in Ireland we are still fortunately able to borrow at very low rates. The EU exists as a separate international entity with the capacity to borrow, but it currently has no debt, compared with the United States, where debt is carried at both federal level as well as state level. To use the analogy of bank accounts, many Member States have already reached their overdraft limit on their personal accounts, but we have a shared account with our partners with no overdraft at all. It makes much more sense for us to collectively use our shared account to finance the Recovery Fund rather than to individually pay more to extend our already large overdrafts. This is where some Member States fear being asked to directly finance others, but this is not what is being proposed. If we borrow at EU level, we should also repay the debt at EU level. The EU at the moment has modest revenue-raising capacity, mostly from custom duties and sugar levies, but these could be expanded, for example, with the proposal for a financial transaction tax at EU level. Also, the original proposal for a €1.5 trillion fund envisaged perpetual or very lifelong bonds, which have a surprisingly low annual cost in comparison to the €1.5 trillion capital figure. It could be financed for about €5 billion in interest payments per annum, and as a perpetual bond, the capital could very well not come up for repayment. The EU has the capacity to service such a debt. Over time, inflation would erode the capital cost to a much lower level, which means that it could be paid off decades later, just as some post-World War II bonds have only recently been paid off. I hope that the idea of a European Recovery Fund will be agreed sooner rather than later, as the future of the EU depends on a successful economic and social recovery after COVID-19. I would like clarity from the Government about whether or not they support a European Recovery Fund along the lines that I have described. I would appreciate a detailed response about what the Government agrees with or disagrees with in relation to any recovery fund. In relation to bond buying by the European Central Bank, which is currently keeping national borrowing rates slow and keeping inflation down, there has been a major challenge to the ECB's quantitative easing approach by the German Constitutional Court. It has made a ruling that would potentially halt participation by the German Bundesbank or the German Government in this policy, which would have major knock-on effects and could jeopardise the stability of national debts in numerous Member States. All of this stems from a legal case taken by an independent group of business people and academics who are ideologically opposed to any burden sharing across EU Member States and who oppose the €2.7 trillion programme. While this ruling excludes the €750 billion pandemic emergency purchase programme, there is now expected to be a further legal challenge to its legality. What is this Government's understanding of the German court decision, and what actions are being taken to ensure that the ECB's bond buying programme can continue, including what actions are being taken to ensure that the pandemic emergency programme is legally robust? Also, what is the Government's understanding of how this national level ruling challenges the authority of the European Court of Justice and the ECB? Key to all of this, Taoiseach, is solidarity. Solidarity amongst EU members and solidarity between the EU and the rest of the world. I believe Europe has a responsibility to be a leader not only in its own recovery, but in the global recovery. We need to stand strong in solidarity with those that need it within our own borders and also throughout the world. In mid-March of this year, we saw 52 doctors and nurses arrive from Cuba to the region of Lombardy in Italy, on a day when the death toll in that country from COVID-19 reached 800. I found that to be an incredible act of global solidarity. The EU needs to be seen to reciprocate this and work to assist countries like Cuba who are being impeded by tightening US embargoes for accessing medical equipment that is much needed to help combat the pandemic. We should use COVID-19 as an opportunity to break traditional enmities and hostilities. As such, I support the call of the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, who called for a waiving of sanctions in order to tackle the crisis. And he said, this is a time for solidarity and not exclusion. We are all bounded by our common humanity, Taoiseach, and we all need to defeat this virus. We believe the EU should be moral leaders on this. Thank you.
This is the second time in just over a decade that we face an economic crisis. This one obviously is very different because life and health is very much centre stage. The economic fallout is as a consequence, obviously, of COVID-19, and I welcome the